On the 10th of May 1996, a tornado outbreak struck Oklahoma in the US. The state had weathered such storms before, but this one would be different. One researcher and her team were in place, waiting for it, with a daring plan to deploy a new device. A device that would, all being well, revolutionize the scientific community's understanding of tornadoes, and drastically reduce deaths as a result of tornado outbreaks. In the course of deploying this device, however, Professor Harding's team would have to face the imminent risk of death, not just once, but 5 times. A tornado outbreak is the name given to a phenomena whereby multiple tornadoes spawn in the same area over the course of several days. Small outbreaks may consist of half a dozen tornadoes, while more serious outbreaks can see the formation of hundreds of distinct twisters. Most tornadoes occur in an area of the central United States which covers Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, an area which is often referred to as Tornado Alley. The storms which occur in this part of the world, and occasionally elsewhere, were at the time classified using the Fujita scale, a measuring system created in the 1970s by meteorologist Ted Fujita. The scale classified tornadoes by measuring the damage that they caused. At the lower end of the scale, F0, were tornadoes that caused very light or very limited damage. At the upper end of the scale, F5, were tornadoes that caused incredible damage, including the destruction of trees and forests, the uprooting of homes and other buildings, and the reduction of material caught in the tornado into small, granular pieces. Colloquially, F5 tornadoes were known by some storm chasers as the finger of God, because of their speed and ferocity. On the 10th of May 1996, the US state of Oklahoma was hit by a particularly severe tornado outbreak. As one of the states that formed part of Tornado Alley, Oklahomans were aware of the danger of extreme weather events, and many had access to reinforced or subterranean storm shelters. However, given how quickly tornadoes can form, they still posed a massive risk. At the time, tools such as weather radar and weather monitoring could provide only around 3 minutes of warning before a tornado struck a given area. One meteorologist was particularly interested in the cluster of storms that began forming in Oklahoma that day. Professor Joe Harding had recently developed a brand new technology, a device that she believed would constitute a better way to study and understand tornadoes, and potentially better predict their movements and formation. This new device was named Dorothy, and was designed to release thousands of independent, lightweight sensor clusters inside the tornado itself. These would then provide detailed, real-time information on the internal structure, wind velocities, flow, and asymmetry of the storm. The new device had generated a great deal of interest, with some researchers claiming that it could allow them to learn more in 30 seconds than they had in the last 30 years. There was only one problem. The device had to be deployed directly in the path of a tornado, something that, especially with large and unpredictable storms, could be extremely dangerous. Professor Harding's team, assembled from researchers and semi-professional storm chasers, had constructed 4 Dorothy devices, and considered this tornado outbreak the ideal time to deploy them. In doing so, they would have to put themselves in significant danger, but they considered this risk worthwhile. If Dorothy performed as they hoped it would, they could potentially increase the warning time ahead of tornadoes from 3 minutes to 15, thus saving thousands of lives. This was a cause that Professor Harding was particularly passionate about, and with good reason. As a child, she had lost her father to a tornado, after her family took shelter in an underground storm shelter, the door of which was secured with only a single rickety bolt. Professor Harding's team was not the only group of scientists tracking the progress of the tornado outbreak. A rival storm-chasing team were also in the area, having developed a similar device. So similar, in fact, that they were accused of having copied the design from Professor Harding. On cue, Jonas Miller, storm chaser, had secured corporate funding for his copycat device and was determined to deploy it before Professor Harding could do so. Despite tension between the two groups, Professor Harding was determined to continue with her life-saving research. On the morning of the 10th of May, she navigated her team into the damage path of a developing tornado near Ouachita in Oklahoma, hoping to be able to deploy one of the Dorothy devices there. However, the tornado unexpectedly increased in power, leaving Professor Harding trapped in a ditch beneath a wooden bridge. The device, along with most of a nearby farm, was completely destroyed in the roar of the storm. So was Professor Harding's truck. Though she survived, she was now in a difficult position, as she needed a working truck with an open bed to have any hope of deploying the remaining Dorothys. Reluctantly, Professor Harding was forced to recruit her ex-husband, who was visiting her so that she could finalize their divorce papers. A keen meteorologist himself, he agreed to lend her his truck, and the team were able to continue their work. Shortly thereafter, they managed to catch up with another tornado, one which soon became a twin pair of waterspouts, shedding black rain over the area. This storm caused significant property damage, killed at least one cow, and almost blew their lead vehicle off the road. Because of how strong and fast-moving it was, they were unable to deploy a Dorothy in time. Professor Harding's team then moved to nearby Ouachita to rest and regroup. It wasn't long, however, before they saw news of a new developing storm in nearby Parlane. Once again, however, despite getting dangerously close to the storm, they were unable to successfully deploy a Dorothy. Powerful winds turned a telephone pole into a lethal weapon. 3 seconds later, it smashed into the second Dorothy, destroying it completely, leaving them with only 2 devices to continue their valuable work. Worse still, as they attempted to have their vehicles repaired in Fairview, a nocturnal tornado struck the town, destroying a drive-in movie theater along with several other buildings, and seriously injuring a member of their team. The storm plowed across the state to Ouachita, where it destroyed the house of Professor Harding's aunt, along with dozens of other homes and businesses. At this point, morale in Professor Harding's team was extremely low. Despite their best efforts, it was beginning to look like it might be impossible to get ahead of the storm, and with each attempt, they were suffering more and more severe losses. Die-hard storm chasers though they were becoming dispirited. It was at this point, however, that Professor Harding was struck by an idea. The haunting sound of the damaged weather vanes in her aunt's garden inspired her to alter the design of the sensor clusters in the 2 remaining Dorothys. Working overnight, her team were able to cut, sculpt, and attach aluminium wings to each of the sensor clusters to enable them to take flight in high winds. With this design change made, the team proceeded to intercept one more storm, the largest they had encountered so far. Weather scientists had already predicted that this particular tornado would develop into an F5, the most damaging category of tornado in existence. On the way to intercept this storm, Professor Harding's team ran into their rival team led by Jonas Miller. Indeed, it appeared that Mr. Miller's team had been following them to try and stay ahead of the storms as, despite a technological advantage, they had a poor basic instinct when it came to understanding tornadoes. Now, Mr. Miller's team forged ahead, approaching the developing F5 tornado ahead of Professor Harding's team, determined to be the first to deploy their device. Despite attempts to warn them about the storm changing direction, they were promptly caught in the tornado. Mr. Miller and his driver were killed instantly when a metal pylon crashed into their vehicle. This loss likely drove home how risky their endeavor was, but Professor Harding's team continued their work regardless, even driving directly through an uprooted house in order to pursue the storm. The first of the remaining 2 Dorothys was almost at once destroyed by a falling tree, leading them to another realization. The device needed to be anchored by a vehicle. With limited options available to them, Professor Harding and her ex-husband decided to use the vehicle they were driving. They activated the final Dorothy, switched the vehicle's speed to cruise control, aimed it at the base of the storm, and leapt out of the moving truck. Now, finally, after so many unsuccessful attempts, they were able to deploy the last Dorothy device. Instantly, a wealth of information about the storm became available to their team. information that would inform tornado research for decades to come. This information, however, was of little use to Professor Harding and her ex-husband. In approaching the storm so closely and then sacrificing their vehicle, they had left themselves terribly exposed. As mere flesh and blood, without the protection of a vehicle, they were in immense danger. They fled to a nearby farm, entered a barn, and attached themselves to partially buried pipework there. Miraculously, they were able to ride out the storm even as it stripped away the entire building surrounding them. Both survived, and the traumatic experience led them to reconcile their relationship and call off their divorce. Professor Harding's work, even now, informs the public perception of tornadoes. And while some criticize the special effects as not particularly realistic anymore, it is nonetheless influential enough to command a sequel as recently as 2024.